Hello again, this is Point on Pally back with another video for you. And in this video we're going to be talking about common Python errors in Maya. This video has been a long time coming for me. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while because there really isn't a whole lot of information. There's information about like specific errors if you search them, but there isn't like a specific thing dedicated to just like what are some Python errors and how do you fix them. And so that's what I wanted to do here. When I've posted Python videos in Maya in the past, I've noticed I've get a lot of comments or messages messaging me about, I get this error, how do I fix it? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a video where we go through some of the most common errors. I try and explain what they mean and what's the best course for fixing them, and also some tricks that might trip you up along the way. So that way you can, when you understand the errors, you can fix them a lot faster. So any project or script or rig you're working on doesn't derail just because you get a certain specific error. So the scene I have here is just a simple 3-joint setup, and the script I have that we're going to be using for a majority of the errors here is it's a locally oriented control script. And in this script, all we're doing here is we're listing the selected joint. We create an icon for the joint, we scale it up a little bit, freeze transforms, make a couple groups for it, parent the icon of the group, and parent constrain it to snap to the joint, and that's pretty much it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over a few of the more common errors here. Each of these scripts that we're going to work with has something off about it, and so it'll return the error for us, and then we can figure out what the problem is. So the first error that we're going to go over is by far the most common error, and that is the syntax error. So what a syntax error is essentially it's the punctuation of your code is off. Either there's too many of one punctuation, like a comma or parenthesis or something, or it's missing. And so the first script here, if I select the joint and then run the script. Oh, and before we do anything, this is really important. If you go to the history menu, make sure show stack trace is on. I'll show you what happens if I turn it off and I run the script. You see, we just get error invalid syntax. Well, this isn't very helpful. This doesn't tell you anything about what line the error is on or what part of the script might the syntax be off on. So this is why show stack trace is very important, because if I clear it and then run the script again, now not only will you get the line that has the error on it, it will also tend to point you in the right direction, quite literally. So here's a little arrow, and it's pointing to where Maya thinks the syntax problem is. And you can pretty much guess what's happening here. So we have all these flags for the circle command here, and all these flags are separated by commas, and we seem to be missing a comma in between. And that's really all the syntax error is usually there's just a missing comma or missing parenthesis or something of the sort. So once I added that comma there, let's run everything. And there you go. There's the locally oriented control with the grouping and everything. So that's all the syntax error is. Now there is one thing I want to point out. Sometimes the syntax error plays a trick on you. So this script is going to look very similar, but you'll notice when we run it that there's going to be something a little bit off here. So it points us to line 8 of the script, which is this parent command here. But if I look at it, well, everything seems to be correct here. there's the open and close parentheses, and the two objects are split by a comma. The punctuation is all correct here. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is, and this is a little trick with syntax, sometimes the line above the line it's telling you is the problem. And in this case, we're missing an end parenthesis on line 7 of this code. I know it says line 18, but when it refers to the error, if I highlight this, then it's referring to line 7 of the highlight, or line 8 in this case. So all it is we're missing an end parenthesis here. So the syntax error says, well, it's thinking that this line is actually part of the line above it, and it's not. So all we really need to do is put that end parenthesis here, and then we run the script. Boom. Everything's working. So that's syntax. Obviously there's many different kinds of syntax errors, but these are the two you most commonly run into. And luckily, with the show stack trace option here, it usually points you exactly in the right direction of the error using these arrows. But again, sometimes it might point you, it's telling you it's a certain line, but it might actually be the line above it. So keep that in mind with these syntax errors. So the next error I want to run into, or I want to talk about, is this one. The can only concatenate list, not string, to list. So this is one I run into so often. So what this essentially means is, and this is dealing usually with kind of older Python scripts, because I'm a little bit stubborn, so sometimes I work with older Python language instead of PyMel language, which is kind of the upgrade for it. But this is more of an issue with older Python. When you're setting attributes, in old Python you would have the object plus, and then in quotations, dot the attribute. So in this case, we're scaling the icon up to times 2 in all axes. But the problem is you're trying to add two things that don't really go together. So if I run this script, and we're actually going to get a couple of instances of this error that I'll explain. So it's saying it's in line 3, so it is right here. The problem is you're trying to access an attribute to something that isn't technically an object. So we're talking about this attribute here, the new icon attribute. And this is one I constantly see all the time. This is, and this one is dealing specifically with the circle command. So one thing I've noticed with the circle command, and this happens usually when you're doing create, NURBS primitive, something like that, is when you create a NURB circle, it usually comes by default with this make NURB circle node when you create the circle. So what that is this node is attached to the main object, and it allows you to adjust certain things about the icon itself. But when I create the icon here, what it actually does is it creates two objects for this attribute. So if I were to add in a line of code here and say print new icon, and then I run the script again, what it returns to us when I print the variable for new icon, it returns two objects. It returns the arm icon, which is the transform object. That's the thing that translates, rotates, and scales. And then this make NURB circle node, which is that node right here that's attached to it. So what the error you're running into here with the concatenate error is you're trying to add an attribute to what is essentially a list. And what we actually need is just this transform object here. Because if we can single out the transform object, then this will work. And the easiest way to do that is in the line for the circle command, at the very end, you type in a 0 in brackets. You'll notice I also have that up here as well. The 0 in brackets says, hey, in this list of the objects I've created, I want this new icon variable to just reference the transform node here. So now, let me delete all these other ones. So now, if I select it and run everything, it works, no errors. So, and you'll notice when I print new icon, all it's returning to me is arm1 icon. So it's actually only returning just the transform node here. It's not referencing the make NURB circle node. Now another thing to point out is with the circle command is there's also this construction history flag that's created by default, and when it's when this flag equals 1, that means it's going to create that make NURB circle node. So if we turn it off, that node won't be attached to it. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that this variable is only going to reference the transform. Unfortunately, it's still going to be put into a list. So even if I were to take that 0 out and then run this, you're still going to get the concatenate error. Because if I run that print statement again, oops, let's spell that right, why don't we? There we go. So if I just run the print statement here, you see it has only the transform, but you'll notice these brackets on the end. That still means it's a list object, which means it's not the singular transform. It's a list, but that list only has one object in it. So even though it's only got one object in it, Maya still references it as a list, so we're still going to get that concatenate error in here. So it's still important, even if you turn the construction history off, to have that 0 at the end. And you'll notice I have the 0 here for selected under the list command here. If I turn that off, we're going to get the exact same error just a line earlier. So if I select this, and I even just run the first 2 lines of code, you're going to get the same error. The reason is when I name the control, I'm naming it based off the name of the joint. And so when this list command returns a list, obviously. So the selected is actually a list object. So I'm not referencing the first joint I selected. So that's another example of making sure you have that bracket 0. If you want to reference all the joints that you have selected, then you're probably going to need something like a loop. Now, as I mentioned before, this is kind of older Python here, adding the variable plus the attribute here. In PyMel, you would normally use something like this, but you actually run into a different error, but essentially it's talking about the same thing. So the error is list object has no attribute blank. And what this is meaning is there's a list attribute, and there's this variable is a list, and we're trying to access the scale attribute, but a list doesn't have attributes. The object does, not a list. So if I run this, there's our error. So we have to do the exact same thing. Put the bracket 0 at the end, and then we run this. Everything works great. So even if you're using the newer PyMel code, you're going to run in. You could run into different errors, but the overall meaning could be the same. So just keep that in mind, as if depending on what kind of coding language you want to use going forward. All right, so the next attribute I want to do, this one I run into probably more than all the others, if I had to guess, list index out of range. This one is all too common. And the reason why, usually, especially with the scripts I do, a lot of my scripts are based off selections. And when you're trying to run a script, and let's say you forget to select the joint here when you run the script, it's going to return the error, list index out of range. And essentially what this means is this new cell attribute here is referencing the stuff I have selected. That's what this SL flag in the list command means. SL equals true means list the selected objects. And that variable, new cell, is being used in the circle command here because I'm doing the naming based off the selected variable. But if I don't have anything selected, then it's going to return this error. It essentially means you're trying to access a list and there's nothing in the list. So that's the problem here. Sometimes this might also mean that you're trying to access a certain numbered item in the list, like a certain index in that list. Like you're trying to access the 4th object in the list, and let's say the list only has 3 things in it. That will also return you that error. So all it is if you see that error, you're using a selection command, like the ls command to select the object, make sure everything's selected when you run it, and then everything works fine after that. So that's what the list index out of range is referring to. You also see this very commonly when you're working with loops. Sometimes you're trying to access where you're trying to loop through a list, and let's say you think that a list is a certain length long, but it's actually not. So it runs through the loop until it doesn't have enough objects in that list, and sometimes it'll return that error as well. So that is the list index out of range. The next error is name example is not defined. So both of these examples are going to deal primarily with variables. So variables are these essentially, I call them nicknames. They're essentially nicknames for certain objects that you create with Python. So this new icon variable is referencing the NURB circle that we created. But when something is either misspelled or you're trying to create a variable that hasn't been referenced yet, you run into this problem all the time. So, there's our list index out of range. Make sure you select it. Let's run it. So, name new del is not defined. Well, I see it's referenced as new cell here, and it's at line 8, so my guess, right here. So all this really is there's a D here instead of an S, since on the keyboard they're right next to each other, which happens so often. So all that is, when you see name is not defined, that usually refers to you're trying to run a variable that doesn't actually exist. And usually that means you've either misspelled the variable you're trying to reference, or you didn't actually create it. So you sometimes get an issue like that where, let's say I don't have a variable for that, and then I try running this. Yeah, well, that's also because I've already run the script, so that's why it's working. So let's change this to new cell. And we'll change all these variables to new cell. We'll try that. Something like that. So if I run this, and then do it, name new cell is not defined. So I have this variable, but I never actually went around to creating the variable in the first place. So now if I run it, Everything works fine. So with the second example here, I'll show you what's happening here. So if I run this, we get name L is not defined. So it's in line 4 here. So this one has a little bit of a different meaning here. So you probably wouldn't even guess what's going on in this, what the problem is here. This is the make identity, which is essentially freeze transforms. And everything looks, this is like the default command, everything looks fine here. What's actually happening here, and this is a special circumstance. This is kind of cruel that I'm doing this, but instead of, you have all these flags that equal 1, well, one of these I actually set to the letter L. So what I'm going to go through and just switch all these to the number 1 because they look exactly the same here. So if I actually run it now, it works fine. So what that was is I had the flag equaling something that it shouldn't be equaling. All these flags here are Booleans, essentially. They're 1s and 0s, and that's all they should be. So if they're anything else, like the letter L, which is essentially, it's thinking that it's a variable, because the letter L in quotations, that's a string. But the letter L just by itself, now it thinks it's a variable like this. So it says it's not defined, so essentially you're trying to access a variable. So very similar meaning to the error as in the first example, but just in a slightly different application here. And that also is very important. Make sure you always check your quotations too, because sometimes if you have a quotation off or something like that, it can convert what you want as a string to a variable, and then you might run into that error again. So that is the example not defined error. And lastly, these errors are more specific to if you're working with an external script. So like I have in Sublime right here. Let me bring that over here. So all this is just a script that all it's doing is a hello world. It's just it's a script with just a single function in it, and the function just says hello world. Alright, so here is the script. All it is just a simple function that just says hello world. Here it all is. Now the reason that we're getting that error is you see the name of the function here, test function, and the name of the function here has a lowercase f, whereas when I reference it here, it's an uppercase f. That's really the most common reason for this error here. Module object has no attribute this because it's just a misspelling, or you capitalize something. So like uppercase, lowercase, that type of stuff does matter a lot when you're scripting. So just be wary of that. And the other one here, name example is not defined. So if I run this script, it says test fila is not defined. And all that is just a misspelling right here. Really should just be test file. So if I run it, there we go. Oh, and I forgot to run this one here. So if I lowercase f it here, run this, hello world. Both of these are now working. So those are just some common errors dealing with external scripts. So that's really all I have for this video. I'll probably add more when I run into more errors that I want to talk about. So keep in mind those errors as you go forward with your scripting, especially if you're new to scripting. If you're an expert in scripting, this is probably, way too beginner's level for you. But for those of you starting in scripting, just keep these errors in mind as you go forward. So if you run into this error, you now know what the cause is for it and how to fix it. And always remember, Google is your best friend. So the easiest way to search for an error is literally just, I'll just show it in the script editor, is literally just say, just copy the error into the Google search and just put it all in quotations, just like that, and just search Maya, like Maya Python, that, and then just copy and paste the error in quotations. Maybe not use the example name there, just do module object has no attribute blank, something like that, and that'll send you to a bunch of websites that are kind of forum websites where everyone has posted just about every error that you could think of on those websites, like Stack Overflow. I believe Creative Cow is the other one. Maya's own personal website, Maya's own forum website has people post that stuff too. So, Google's your best friend when it comes to searching for errors. But at least for these common ones, I hope this will help you kind of understand what the errors mean and how to fix them quickly. So if you have any questions about those errors, or you have some more ideas for errors that you'd like me to do, please leave a comment below in the video. And as always, don't forget to like or subscribe, tell your friends, and let's keep the channel and the content going. Thanks again.